Good afternoon, and welcome to today's event. It's wonderful to see everyone this afternoon. As we begin, I would like to first extend some thanks. I want to thank all of you here for participating in this session with Dr. Imad. This topic and conversation is not only timely, but one that is important and necessary as we strive to create a learning and campus environment that understands and best supports the learners, the educators, and the various supporting staff and offices on our campus. Next, I want to thank Dr. Stephanie Whitehead, Director of our Center for Faculty Development, for arranging this event. Thank you, Stephanie. I'd also like to extend some thanks to the group of about 14 faculty and staff who attended a LEAP Indiana Fourth Monday webinar this past February about trauma-informed teaching. I also attended the webinar, and afterwards, when I asked this group about their interest in continuing the conversation, they quickly responded with an enthusiastic yes. That, and the fact that IU East had such good representation at this webinar, is indicative of the high degree of interest and care our campus has in supporting students. I would also like to thank our event sponsor, First Bank Richmond, and last but not least, express our gratitude to Professor Imad for agreeing to share her research and insights with us today. With that, it is my honor to introduce our speaker to you. Dr. Imad is a neuroscientist and professor of pathophysiology and biomedical ethics at Pima Community College, a Hispanic serving institution, where she has been since 2008. She is the founding coordinator of their Teaching and Learning Center and is also a Gardner Institute Fellow. Dr. Imad received her undergraduate degree in philosophy from the University of Michigan with a focus on the philosophy of science and consciousness. She received her doctorate in cellular and clinical neuroscience from Wayne State University in Detroit and completed an NIH institutional research and academic career development postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Arizona. In addition to the work she'll talk about today, I would also like to highlight a short article of hers from the spring 2019 AAC&U Liberal Education Quarterly titled Reimagining STEM Education, Beauty, Wonder, and Connection. I recall how much it resonated with me when I read it, thinking about my own experiences as a female graduate student and faculty member in a STEM discipline, but also very much now in my current role, where student and faculty success are things I know are very much connected to each other. The article is both honest and inspiring and related to the topic of today's discussion. We'll get a link to it put in the chat for all of you. Today, Dr. Imad will be discussing the neuroscience of toxic stress and its impact on learning in a session titled, Ours is Not a Caravan of Despair, Trauma-Informed Teaching for Restorative Justice. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Imad.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for the invitation, for the kind introduction. Thank you for taking the time to spend the afternoon with me and your colleagues to learn about the topic of trauma and how we could best support our students and our colleagues. So my intention when I began to offer these sessions on trauma-informed education, what drove me to do that is, number one, my background. So I do research on stress and emotions and self-regulations, and also my interaction with the students over the years at Pima Community College. And so I received a small grant from the foundation to work with students to offer what I call Hello Brain mini workshops to teach about the brain, to teach about stress and how we could regulate stress. And it was quickly apparent to me how empowering these sessions were and how often students would say, oh, I didn't know this was normal. Oh, I didn't know this was my physiology. And so last year, when the pandemic hit and when schools started going online and it looked like we were in for a long haul, I experienced a lot of anxiety and a lot of trauma and post-traumatic stress uh, syndrome. And I began to really, in order to regulate and heal, if you will, we need to talk about the what we're going through. And so I put out the work to share with the community of educators and leaders in higher education, in part so we could work together on how are we going to support each other, how are we going to support our students. So what I want to offer you today is just a little bit of background on what happens to our brain when we experience ongoing toxic stress. And what are some of the things we could do about it for ourselves and for our students? I recognize that a lot of you are doing many of the things that I'm going to mention because you care, you love your students, you love the profession, you love your colleagues, you're here. This alone is a testament to your passion and commitment. And so I want to invite you to take what resonates with you, to share in the chat things that come up, questions or comments. If you want to put an article, if you want to say, oh, I do this and I add that and so on, I want to invite you to do so. So I'm going to begin by sharing my presentation, my screen with you, and you will get a copy to the presentation at the end. So, what I hope to do today is to talk about the neuroscience, what we know from the biology of the brain about what happens when we experience trauma, and specifically how it impacts learning. And then I want to share principles of a trauma informed care and specifically a trauma informed approach to education, whether we are in the classroom or whether we are in the student services. And then throughout the presentation, I'm going to talk about the theme of justice and equity and how, when done intentionally and deliberately, trauma-informed education is really, it is aligned with equity. It is aligned with the inclusive agenda. It really is about restoring justice at the level of the individual and the level of the community. So I titled this, Ours is Not a Caravan of Despair. This first part of the title comes from a poem by a Persian poet, Jalaluddin Rumi, where in it he talks to young people and says, despair not, our way is not one of hopelessness. Listed there is my email. Feel free to email me and feel free to tweet about this presentation. So we're educators. We want our students to learn, to retain the information, to apply the information. We want long life learners that leave our institutions and become effective, empowered members of society. Now, at the heart of learning, when we look at it from a physiological, from a neurological, from a cellular perspective, learning is about changing structures in the brain, making connections, strengthening connections, severing connections. And we know from the science of the brain is that there are certain conditions that optimize that structural change and malleability. So in this article, two neuroscientists, Kimberly Tanner and Melinda Owens, they assert that for educators to become effective innovators, it is important that we have some understanding of the brain, some understanding of what helps connections form, what makes it difficult for those connections to form. So, similarly, when we talk about stress and its impact on learning, I assert that it is important to have some basic understanding of what happens to the brain when we're under chronic or toxic stress, so we may begin to recognize and regulate it. So it's all about the brain. I see the world, I see the world through many lenses, but one lens that is very grounding for me is the brain. And it's about the brain and its interpretation of what we experience. And so the key to defining any experience, whether I am sitting in the classroom, whether I'm at the grocery store, it has to do with how the brain sees it, the perception of the brain, and not the event itself. Now, for a long time in science and in biopsychology and the academy, used to be thought that emotions and reasons are separate and they're antithesis. And it turns out that the past 20 years or so, we've known from work of neuroscientists and neurologists, is that that's actually not the case. We can't. It is impossible to separate emotions from thinking, from reason. In fact, the feeling comes before the thinking. So when information comes into the brain puts in an emotional importance to it. And it happens subconsciously. The brain says this is worth investing energy in or not. And based on that emotional significance, the decision then is made. Do I invest? Do I send that to the center in the brain that deals with reason and motivation and problem solving and short-term memory? So specifically, you could think of the brain as there are three major structures or parts. There is, and in this cartoon diagram, it is color coded: the red, the blue, and then the green. And so the red part of the brain is the part of the brain that develops first. It's the part of the brain that is dealing with answering the question, am I safe? This is the brainstem. And so it deals with our survival. And then we go up in the hierarchy. Then there is tucked in within the brain, there is the emotional brain. And that part of the brain is dealing with social interaction, our place in the world, if you will. It's asking the question, am I loved? Do I matter? Am I part of? Am I with? And then there is the cortex, that's the latest developed part of the brain, the green, and it deals with processing external information, problem solving, learning, motivation. So there is a hierarchy. Information come into the brain, and the brain is interested in keeping me alive. It's interested in conserving energy. It is also interested in thriving and innovation and creativity. But there's going to be a hierarchy. There have to be certain answers, certain questions have to be answered in order to go on to the next step and the next step. And those regions are constantly talking to one another. So sensory information come into the brain, they go to the red part. The red part says clear. They go to the blue part. The blue part is going to do a comparison. It's going to take the information and it's going to make predictions about our survivability, our well-being. When information come into that part of the brain and it gets stuck there because we don't have answers, because we don't have a social network, it is stressful on the brain. And when the stress is unresolved, we could go into a chronic or a toxic situation of stress. So what that means, and this article highlights the connection between the emotions and the learning. So this article highlights that emotions are social and emotional being in the world are critical to learning. In fact, the emotions can act as a gateway to learning, where positive emotion can enhance our ability to then send information to that green part of the brain, process the information there, learn, problem solve. But on the other hand, negative emotions, strong negative emotions can can stifle the learning. What's happening right now is that we, our students, our children, our families, the world, we've experienced a year of challenge. And for some people, they were experiencing challenges before the pandemic hit. The pandemic accentuated those challenges, poverty and racism and those who are on the margins in our society. So we're experiencing a lot of challenges that are challenging, in particular, that blue part of the brain. So what do I mean by that? Neuroscientists describe the brain as the way it processes sensory information as a sophisticated, if you will, statistical machine or statistical program. So we're constantly gathering information about our surrounding to build a worldview, to make predictions about our well-being, our survivability. The brain does not handle uncertainty very well. The brain would like to be in control, so it could make those predictions, so it could solve problems. When we're in a state of uncertainty, it is stressful on the brain. So over the summer, I worked with thousands of educators, and I asked the question, what is bothering you most about the current situation? And to be honest, I asked the question in part because I was trying to get to why I was having so much anxiety. After all, I work, I've worked on emotions and trauma, and I was still experiencing a lot of unrest. So when I want to show you in the next slide, when I took the responses from educators, almost 1,000 of them, and I put them into a word cloud and I projected the word cloud, the bigger the word, the more prominent that answer was. This is what I got. So when I looked at it, what jumped out at me is the word uncertainty, the word lack, future, family, students, impact, information. And in fact, I'm not surprised. The brain, our individual brains, and collectively, our collective consciousness was struggling with what is going to happen. And in fact, we don't have concrete answers. Yeah. So what is going to happen? And our students undoubtedly were struggling with that perpetual uncertainty. Specifically, when it comes to our students, we have some idea about their struggles. So this is from the Hope Center for College Community and Justice. This is a report that was published in July 2020, and more recently, the Hope Center published a much bigger report. So in the report that I'm showing you, they looked at almost 40,000 students, and they asked them, they were interested to see how are they able to handle schoolwork? Are they able to focus? Are they able to? In addition, what the researchers did, they wanted to see a full picture, right? They wanted to see the social aspect of being a student. And what you could see here is they report 3 in every 5 students were experiencing basic life insecurity. They were struggling with basic life necessities, food and shelter. So if you think back to the cartoon diagram of the brain, the blue part and the red part, when we don't know where our next meal is going to come from, whether we're going to be evicted, where we're going to sleep, whether a security guard or an officer is going to show up and knock at a window as we're sleeping in a parking lot in the street somewhere because we don't have shelter, that is going to tell the brain, what, hang on a second, we gotta prioritize survival over learning, right? Learning about geometry and geography and literature. The report also highlights, it mirrors the disparity in the racial disparity. The report highlights that there is a racial gap, that students who are marginalized, who are already experiencing struggle, are struggling the most. So it's important to also note that this phenomenon here, food and shelter insecurity, didn't happen because of the pandemic. The pandemic accentuated, but the pandemic in a way held a mirror for us in higher ed to see what a lot of educational leaders were already saying, that our students were struggling before March 2020. There are reports from the World Health Organization and the CDC and the American Health Association highlighting that there is a great deal of mental health, anxiety, and struggles among young people. And so there is a moral imperative that I see for higher education to not have an afterthought attention or an ad hoc or look at for mental and emotional health, but that we center moving forward well-being of the students, of the staff, of the faculty, where care and kindness becomes the ground on which we stand. So it's important to note, and I've highlighted, but I want to repeat that we're not talking about typical stress. We're talking about what we call traumatic stress. And this word trauma is, I want to spend just a few minutes talking about what I mean by trauma. So trauma is getting into a car accident or coming back from combat or being in an abusive relationship. Those are all traumatic. And trauma is also pernicious. It can be insidious. It is any negative event that puts us in a position of helplessness. So why helplessness? Remember, the brain is about what? It wants to be in control. And when it can't control, it can't solve, that helplessness can be very traumatic. In fact, it's not just negative, it can be overwhelming and it can be frightening. And frightening at the level of the brainstem and at the level of the limbic system. The brain is unsettled. It can't answer the question. It can't figure out what it's going to do. And so in a way, the alarm system is turned on, and that alarm system stays on when we're dealing with trauma and traumatic stress, to the point that it takes away our ability to rebound. So, and I'm going to explain what rebound means. So again, when we interpret something as being traumatic or harmful or threatening, or we can't solve it, we experience that trauma, that toxicity at the level of the body and the level of the brain. So what is the body going to do? Well, in a healthy nervous system, we go back and forth between getting activated and relaxing, reacting and being subdued, going back to. And this back and forth, this ability to go back to baseline, this is called the normal range, or we refer to it also as the resilient range. So there is resilience that we use in everyday language, and then there is a biological resilience. And the biological resilience is something that when the nervous system is activated and it can go back to the rest, it replenishes the energy it used to solve a problem. That person has biological resilience. Now, what happens when we experience trauma? Think about energetically. The brain perceives something as being threatening or harmful, yes? And the brain is going to say, I got to reprioritize where I put my energy. So it's going to spend a lot of time trying to solve, trying to control, trying to in that state of fear, that anxiety. And it doesn't have a chance to replenish its energy. And so as a result, when we experience traumatic event, that ongoing toxic stress, it becomes difficult to rebound. It becomes difficult to go back to baseline. So what that means in terms of trauma, trauma impacts our biological resilience. What does that mean in terms of our teaching, our students? Well, I often hear faculty, sometimes I hear parents say, we just got to be resilient. Grit is the new word right now. And I encourage you to look at the research on grit, that it undermines the whole picture, right? In terms of biological resilience, it's not something I could turn on or off, right? Because something happens at the level of the nervous system. So there are two articles that I highly recommend viewing. One is by Stuart Schenker. Stuart Schenker is a Canadian neuroscientist educator who writes for Psychology Today, and he writes for parents and teachers. And he wrote an article several years ago, says, why is my kid stupid? And he is answering the question for parents who postulate that, you know, their kids don't know math because they don't want to do math, because they're lazy. Why is my kid lazy? They don't want to do math. They don't want to engage. And in the article, he outlines that it's not a matter of they don't want to, or they are lazy, or they don't have the cognitive ability. They are overwhelmed. And he talks about what happens when we don't replenish our energy, when we don't reset. And then the second article that I recommend is by a doctor in Flint, Michigan, who exposed the lead situation in the water, drinking water in Flint, Michigan, Dr. Mona Hana Atisha. And she wrote an op-ed last May titled, I'm sick of telling children to be resilient. And what she was underscoring is that when you're dealing with poverty and racism and marginalization and on, and all these ongoing adversities, it is a system problem. It's more than, hello kid, be resilient. So on the one hand, we want to challenge our students, right? We owe it to them to challenge them. And on the other hand, we have to help them feel safe and connected and empowered so we can create that optimal learning environment so we can challenge them. So what happens when we're in that? Just a few more things, and then I'll take some questions and answer, and then I'll talk about practically. So what happens when we're in that state of fight or flight? Again, we are trying to solve a problem. The brain is going to put us in a state of high alert. We are not going to focus on creativity and solving a problem. We're hyper focused on trying to escape, right? So we become hyper vigilant. We're reflexive. We're not really reflective. This system keeps us alive, but it costs us a lot of energy. And what it does to the brain, actually, the brain, that blue part of the brain is going to overtake the rest of the brain. The term that neuroscientists use, and people who study trauma and stress, they say that it's called the limbic brake. The emotional part of the brain puts a brake on the remaining part of the brain. Now, when we are optimal at thinking and solving, and when the emotional part of the brain is in harmony with the rational part of the brain. So we lose that integration, we lose that harmony, we lose that balance when we go into this fight or flight. And when this remains active all the time, it can be a disaster physiologically. So as I said, that the brain is going to prioritize survival over learning. And when that fight or flight keeps going, when we don't resolve the uncertainty, the isolation is an evolutionarily conserved traumatic experience. What that means is it's part of our DNA that we don't handle isolation well. That blue part of the brain can't answer, am I part of? Am I with? Am I loved? Am I seen? Do I belong? So when we stay in that constant state of chronic stress, what happens? We could go into another term here. It's called an amygdala hijack. So the amygdala is a small but powerful structure within that blue part of the brain. And the amygdala becomes hyperactive. We actually see the activity, it goes up. If you do neuroimaging, you see the colors light up within that region. And what the amygdala is doing, the amygdala is saying, shut down information to the cortex. I don't have energy. Learning is not important. Academic learning, problem solving, creativity, attention, motivation, all of those, they take a back seat because the amygdala is doing what? It's keeping us in that fight or flight. So it's really important. What does this mean in terms of learning? In terms of learning, that when we are in that state of toxic stress, chronic stress, it physically, physiologically, morphologically, anatomically, you get the picture. It impacts with our ability to learn, to engage with the material, to retain information. So, is learning possible? Should we even be sending students to school? Should we be lecturing? Is it right? And the answer is, of course, the answer is yes, but we need an intervention. So what do I mean by this? I told you one side of the story. What happens to the brain when it's under that chronic stress? But there's another side to the story. And the other side to the story is that the brain is malleable. It is flexible. It is plastic. We are not dealing with a structural damage. we are dealing with chronic stress and how we respond to stress and what environments we create to welcome our students to will help us answer that question in an affirmative way. So I want to pause right here and see the second part of the presentation. I want to talk about what is this intervention that can help us answer this question in an affirmative way. And so I want to see if there are any questions. You could put them into the chat. You could raise your hand. I know somebody is monitoring the live stream, so you could also put your questions there. And then we'll continue. So any questions or comments, or if you want to just clarification, I invite you to do so.
There are a couple of comments here. One is from Cheryl LaForge. She's an associate professor of political science here at East. And her comment is, your point about students, especially on the margins, experiencing trauma prior to the pandemic is important. There's been so much talk about, quote, returning to normal. And I worry that we are bypassing / missing the point that normal was not equitable pre-pandemic.
Thank you so much. I'm really grateful for that comment. So we have so much research. Trauma is not just in the moment. Trauma it can be one event, it can be a series of events, it can be in the moment, it can be a generational event, and even intergenerational. So we know from the work in the field of epigenetics that we can inherit trauma, right? We know from the work of the CDC, Kaiser, and other reports that children who are born into poverty, they experience that adversities impact them throughout life. So being in a quarantine and being in a pandemic is traumatic for a lot of people, but so is experiencing microaggression. The work of Harold Sue and others, they show that when I experience microaggression, micro invalidation, and I actually struggle with the word micro because it minimizes the effect. But what happens when we experience those microaggression, the message it sends to the blue part of the brain is, wait, do I matter? Am I seen? Do I belong? When we can't answer the question, it is stressful on the brain. Now imagine for a student or a faculty or a human being when they experience that day in and day out, or when they see others experience it and we can't do anything about it. We know that what that does, it causes a spike in cortisol. This is physiology, right? So to your point, great point. We have to be very careful because the normal worked for a lot of people, but it didn't work for a lot others. And so when we move forward and we say, got to talk about have a new normal, it's important right now that we pause. What is normal, and from whose perspective, and who are we not inviting, or who's not at the table to decide what this normal is? As I said, we had a problem before the pandemic, and for some reason, higher education did not center well-being. As we move forward, it is critical that we, as a South African scholar, Bayo Ekomolafi says, the times are urgent, it's important to pause. So this is really important. It is, and again, the South African activists who have worked on disability and inclusivity, they say that conversation about us without us is not about us. So as we move forward, it's critical that we have we pause and we consider, what does normal mean, and who are we excluding, or who are we keeping? Which system are we perpetuating with this new normal, if you will? So thank you for that.
All right, we've got a question from Jill Schweitzer, who is assistant professor in biochemistry. Her question is, how do mental health struggles fit into trauma?
So, I mean, mental health experts and people who study trauma will say that at the heart of mental health issues, there is unresolved trauma, right? So Dan Siegel, who's a psychiatrist and he works on trauma and attachment, he says when you look at all of the diagnostics, what you see, there is a lack of integration. There is a failure of integration, and that usually happens when the brain, the body, experiences trauma. So part of what motivates me to keep talking about trauma, I'd much rather talk about love and beauty. Part of what motivates me to continue to talk about trauma, especially as we move forward, is the awareness, the research, that if we don't work on it, the body stores it. And then it's going to manifest itself in diseases and mental and ongoing mental problems. So, and so I want to, and I also want to be careful that here I'm not, so I'm going to talk about trauma-informed education. We're not therapists. Most of us are not therapists, we're not clinicians, and we're not going to diagnose or treat or heal. It's important that I'm going to talk about how can we cultivate a sanctuary, if you will, in our classes, so students can feel, for the time they are with us, so they could feel connected and safe. And we want to relax the nervous system just a little bit. And at the same time, I think it is imperative that we advocate for mental health resources college-wide that is inclusive, culturally embedded, and accessible. So, so yeah, thank you for that question.
And Shara had another question.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a half-life of this kind of limbic break? In other words, once the stress is gone, does the brain rebound quickly, or does trauma hold on?
That's a great question. It depends. So it depends on the person. It depends on the trauma. We know that it can rebound. We actually know from clinicians that work on trauma treatment and therapy that you can rebound. And part of that is in a way, negotiating with the brain and refocusing. And so it's not a structural change that happens in many of those cases. It's not. And so in a lot of the therapies that work on trauma, for example, EMDR and ART and others, what they're trying to do is shift focus. We have a pain network in the brain, and we have a reward network in the brain. So I'll give you an example. And this is a small example. So what that means is, I'm right now, like many of you, I am experiencing grief and anxiety and just uncertainty, and that's painful. and it can be, and it is stressful, it can be traumatic and so on. And I also can engage in what would make me relax, what would make me feel connected and happy and grateful and so on. So there are techniques that can shift, that can help us rebound. And what I want to propose today is, again, we're not clinicians, we're not therapists. You could, I mean, some have argued that we are like therapists, but what I want to propose is, for the time the students are with us, we hope to create a space that tells that blue part of the brain that I see you and that you matter, that I have your back. We are, the brain is a social organ. And what that means, what Dan Siegel and Gabor Mate and others, what they talk about is that our being with each other, even if it's not in person, the way I look at the camera and the way I smile, your brain picks it up and makes interpretation. And this feeling of being with, or being that you matter. And so we can do certain things to just a little bit alleviate from that anxiety. So thank you for that question.
Do you want to continue with the questions, or do you want to dig in?
So I see that there are 2 questions in the chat, and I don't know if I addressed them.
Okay.
Yeah.
The one from Melissa Blankenship, who is a lecturer in the English department.
Mm-hmm.
She wrote, "The biggest issue for me is managing course requirements, which are non-changeable, with the traumatized students who exist within my educational expertise, but need my empathy and care. This is compounded by my interest in saving all of their educational experience within the course and passing it. The need for the expenditure of this emotional energy is one of the hardest parts of my teaching life."
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's a great comment. So I want to remind us, and this is because we care, and we're in teaching because we love teaching. We love our students, that we can't solve. We cannot. And a lot of times when students come to us with their problems, they know we can't solve it. They know we can't take years of adversities, but they just want to be seen. They know they want they want to know that they matter. So, and I have to tell myself that I can't solve it. I could advocate, but I can't save necessarily. So when I talk about a trauma-informed education, you will notice that I'm not going to say anything about revising your curriculum, revising your course materials. It is about how you show up and the space you cultivate. So it doesn't require that you compromise the materials. It doesn't require that you revamp your entire curriculum. It is really about those touch points. It is about, sending an email to the student to say, I got your email, I will reply to you. I noticed you were not in class. I hope you're okay. It is about starting your Zoom session or starting your class with saying, I know this is tough. We are going to get through it together. It is about revealing our humanity to our students and seeing theirs. Words, when they come from the heart, are empowering and healing. And for the time that they are with you, the students, it's those little shots, if you will. Can't believe I used the word shot, but of empathy that we're giving them. So thank you for that comment. And there's one more from Kelly.
From Kelly, yeah. What resources on well-being would you recommend for early career students? I'm thinking of theming my writing class on well-being in the fall.
That's amazing. Yeah. So there's a lot of I would say, it depends. Do you want general well-being, or do you want to focus on uh, there's a lot that has been written about the power of writing in the healing process, in processing emotions and leveraging, harnessing the power of positive emotions, communities. And so um, I would say have some kind of introduction to the students about why you want them to focus on well-being, and then invite the students to share with you what is it that they want to focus on. Do they want to focus on working through negative emotions, or harnessing positive emotions? Do they want to focus on the power of the community? There's a lot of research that was actually published by FEMA that looked at communities that experience adversities, and those who recover get back on there as a community, as a whole. And the common denominator, and they look at post 9/11, post Katrina, is the power of the collective. So it's this community, it's this being with, it's this. And so one thing is, how can we leverage the healing power of the community to sustain, to achieve well-being? So that's wonderful. So I want to thank everyone for your insightful comments and questions. And what I want to do right now is talk about this intervention. So this intervention is not something I came up with. It's not something, it's been around for years. You've been doing it. It is an ethics of care. It is about relationship. It is about empowering others. You could argue that Paulo Freire wrote about it. You could argue that Bell Hooks has written about this. So it is about creating a situation, cultivating a classroom that helps calm the nervous system down. And this is, when we do that, then we could reestablish that harmony, that integration. This is grounded in, again, I mentioned this earlier, in the understanding that we're relational, that the brain is a social organ. What that means is what we do impact others, impact their, how they perceive and react to the situation. This is a really easy to read, wonderful article by Dan Siegel, talking about the notion of interpersonal biology and how we can use that framework to cultivate mental health. So a trauma-informed care says what? It says, I realize, the educator, the parent, the caregiver, the healthcare practitioner, that trauma is something pervasive. Sometimes I think we're all traumatized, right? To various degrees. And that trauma, if it's not resolved and there's accumulation of adversities on top, another one, what happens, it impacts how we show up in the world. It impacts our ability to engage, in the case of being students, engage with the materials, to solve the problem, to learn, to retain. And so as the educator, I'm going to recognize that when a student seems to me that they are not motivated, or they are what that article Stuart Schenker says, lazy, that there is something behind. There is a bigger picture. It is likely that the student is coping. Think about how many of us over the summer, certainly I did, I just experienced that fogginess. I experienced that if someone said to me, do you want the red pen or the purple pen, I felt overwhelmed. So that easy to get overwhelmed, that difficulty to make decisions. Right? So we experience, a lot of us experience that, and our students perhaps are still experiencing it. So we respond. And how do we respond? We can't take away the stress. But what we could do is, I'm going to talk about what can we do to cultivate, to build, to offer a space that can be a sanctuary for them, so we can engage them, so we can cover the materials. And it's really important. This trauma-informed work is sitting, or it is centered around cultural humility. So what does that mean? So the nature of the way we think and the way we all have biases. We bring our background with us. So I want to make sure that I'm going to preemptively recognize and mitigate my biases. I don't want to put a student consciously or unconsciously in a situation where they can't answer the question, do I matter? That is traumatizing. And so to have an intersectional lens, what does that mean? That our students to recognize their identities, their multiplicities, to really get to know the students, get to know our students. So I often hear, and we talked about some of this, there are some misconceptions about trauma-informed education. I talked about the first one. We don't need to be psychologists or therapists. We're not treating, we're not talking about medications, we're not talking about, nor do we, it's really important, oftentimes, the other day I was doing a session on trauma-informed education, and one of the questions that I had was, how is this going to impact the workforce of the United States? Are we gonna have graduates who are not ready to be in the workforce? Because, and I said, wait a second, we are not talking about dumbing down the materials. We're not lowering academic expectations. We are not talking about students can get away with everything. Why? Number one, we actually want structure when we're experiencing traumatic stress. The brain, that structure that we give is going to allow the brain to engage in predictable behavior. So part of the anxiety that we experience is we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know when the vaccine is we don't know this, we don't know that. That's a lot of uncertainty. When students show up to us, we want to have a structure for them. Sure, we want to be flexible. We want to help them if they don't meet the deadline, but it's really important that they have a structure they can follow. And I'm going to talk more about it. And then with respect to number three, it would be a travesty if we just said, all right, no, we're not going to cover the material, and we're not going to challenge you, and we're not going to, because what will happen when the student goes to the next class and they didn't learn anything, right? As a matter of fact, when we use that lens of a trauma-informed, culturally competent education, we are enabling the student, we're empowering the students to be challenged academically. They're up to that challenge. They're brilliant, right? Number four, I often hear that, well, this doesn't apply to my school because I have number four and number five, but because my students didn't experience trauma, we were in a privileged school or a privileged neighborhood or this or that. And it's important to keep in mind that that it's not just that trauma is not just for schools and neighborhoods that have high poverty, right? Trauma is also about seeing schools that are that are situated in a low socioeconomic background, students, peers, and not being able to do anything, seeing the injustice, seeing the trauma, seeing the oppression, and just being stuck, not being able to do anything. So it's important to keep that in mind. And again, we're not in the business of saying this person's traumatized, this person is not. I am just telling myself that you know what, Mace, just take it for granted. Everybody is struggling. Everybody is struggling. And so I move forward with that. So the National Center for Trauma-Informed Care, they put this infographics over the summer. And this infographic is just, those are guiding principles for if you want to use a trauma-informed lens, this is what you want to follow. You want to make sure that the person you're working with feels safe. You want to foster relationship. Trust and transparency are critical for safe relationship. And if you're working with a group of people, make sure that you harness, you leverage the power of the community, the peers. The reason for that is we know from trauma work is that therapists and clinicians is a lot of times when somebody I could talk to someone and I could talk about the trauma and what they could do, and a lot of times they listen to it better or they feel more comfortable when they're talking with their peers. Number 5 and 6 is about empowering. Empowering how? Co-creating together. It's not just I give you the information. We pause and we talk about it. What do you think? You have expertise. You bring a lot of experiences and assets that enrich the learning environment. Share those with us. And number 6 really shouldn't be number 6. It should be the foundation, is that, again, we have this understanding that people come with experiences and identities and they intersect. We don't want to make assumptions about our students. So what I did is I'm going to focus on 3. I'm going to focus on the safety, the connection, and the resources. And here I say, and this is not just me, I think intuitively we know that in order for us to engage, to learn, to thrive, we need to feel safe, right? The brain needs to feel safe and connected. And so that red, that blue, and then resources. So to feel safe, there are many ways that we could, and I'm sure a lot of you are already doing it. And I want to focus on communication and uncertainty. So reducing uncertainty, how can we reduce uncertainty? One of the ways the brain does not feel in control is when it experiences a lot of uncertainty. And when it experiences a lot of uncertainty, again, it loses agency. So what can we do in our courses? It doesn't have to be revamping the entire course. What can we do in our courses to provide student options so they can choose? So they have, the brain has that sense of being in control. Number 2, when students show up, we want to give them information that helps them succeed in the course. The syllabus, focus the syllabus. They know exactly where to go. There are no hidden agendas or curriculum or syllabi. Let us be transparent with that. And focusing the information. A lot of times, I used to have a 13-page syllabus, and it's overwhelming. So how can we reduce that? And then the third one, and I talked a little bit about that, is creating or offering predictable structure. And this predictable structure allows the brain to do what? The student is going to know that every Wednesday I know every Wednesday I'm going to turn this in, and every Friday I need to do that. And when they do, and they meet those milestones, the brain experiences positive reinforcement. And when the brain experiences a lot of positive reinforcement, we can begin to feel that sense of, we feel relaxed. Leveraging communication. So communication is not just here, do this and do that, and then this is deadline and so on, but communicate to reveal your humanity, to let the students know you see theirs. So connect and invite regularly. Right? And again, a lot of us are overwhelmed, overworked, exhausted. It takes one sentence from a teacher that really is compassionate, is genuine, for me to read it and say, yeah, I want to go there. I want to show up to that class, right? And then modeling empathy and reassuring. And what I mean by that is a lot of times in my communication, I've been communicating to the students, I'm so proud of you. I know this is difficult. Congratulations. I will help you. We have an exam coming up. And so this reassuring, and it becomes part of the culture of your course. Number 3, in addition to telling the students, this is what you need to do, tell them why. And this tell them why, it goes to the brain. And the brain, when the brain is experiencing that toxic stress, that traumatic stress, remember, it's going to say, why should I worry about this? Why should I put energy towards this? Why? So when we give the why, we're doing this unit because this is how it relates to this and that. When we share the why, it helps the brain see that I'm not wasting energy. Let me invest. So even before the pandemic, what I used to say to students when they come in, every single time they come into class, I say, so take a moment, remind yourself why you are here. And then when we're talking about, I say, why should you care about acid base? And what it's doing again, it is in a way, it is presenting an argument to the brain. There is a reason I'm not wasting my energy. Connections. We are social beings. We love to belong. And so how can we cultivate communities? How can we connect with the students and help them connect with each other, learning about them? So before the class starts, before the semester starts, or maybe in the middle of the semester, I send students in the beginning of the semester just a one question. That tell me something about you that helps you feel alive. What makes you laugh? What makes you learn their names? Ask them how they are doing. The second one is, we do well when we solve problems together. And so perhaps you have an opportunity in your class to ask students to bring an issue in the community, a problem, a question that relates to the course materials, and you investigate it together. If I'm teaching environmental science, a student may bring a question about sustainability in the Tucson community, and what can we do about the temperature. And also, part of a culture that we want to cultivate is, a lot of times, students, from research I've done, students want the teacher, the instructor, the faculty to facilitate relationships between them. And so what if you just make it part of the culture of your class for students to check up on each other? This is optional. This is not, if you don't, then you fail and so on, but talk constantly about it. And I say, for example, to my students, I say, those are people that are going to be your colleagues in the future. You may end up doing a a residency with somebody or going to nursing school with somebody. Right? And so when someone is not in class, I say, has anyone checked up on John to see if John needs the note, or that becomes the culture. So we want to, part of the connection is not just connecting with each other, but connecting with the materials, connecting, forming, having meaning and purpose. So here I say that, so a lot of what happened over the past year, a lot of our goals, students, were interrupted. So, and that's difficult on the brain, especially for young people. We catch ourselves thinking, or they catch themselves thinking, what does all this mean? What is the purpose of this? So help your students in the course establish goals. Your goal is going to be to complete this unit and that unit. And then when they establish those goals and they meet those goals, celebrate them. It's about positive reinforcement. Last week, you didn't know about the cardiovascular system. By the end of next week, you're gonna be able to describe what happens to a drop of blood from the time it enters the heart until it leaves. That's a milestone, so celebrate that. And then identify the why. This one is more than this unit. This is, why does this education matter? Why does it matter to the community, to your family, to the world, and so on? So we're coming to an end. The last thing I want to talk about before we have discussion is so we how we show up. We cultivate, we foster safety, cultivate community, and also support. So I think, and this is for the institutions and also for our courses, centering well-being. So centering well-being is taking the time to pause, to ask, how are you? Right? For example, I'm trying this idea of offering a mental health day where students can take the day off to learn about mental health, to learn about what are some of the things we could do to become, to handle stress better, to learn about trauma, to learn the resources. Because what happens when a student really is struggling, when we are struggling, sometimes it's really difficult to get out of bed, let alone get out of bed, look at the internet, find a number, call the number, make it. So let's preemptively do it. What happens if I give them a day off? They learn about these resources, they give me feedback. So that's the providing and normalizing mental breaks, because there's still stigma around mental health. I know we talk about, so for example, even before the pandemic, I would invite a counselor to my class. So he or she or they talk about what resources are offered at the school and how they can help the students. And I want to normalize it. I want to destigmatize it. And so, sure, we're going to talk about the negative emotions. We're going to invite, and also it's really important that we, as I mentioned earlier, we leverage the power of the positive emotions. So intentionally take a moment to talk about what you're grateful for, how grateful you are that the students are there with you, how grateful you are. What happens when we engage in these behavior intentionally is, this is what I mean by shifting focus in the brain. And it's really important that we pause as educators, as teachers, as staff members, because it's so important that we pause to reflect on the question of why what we're doing matters for the well-being of our students, our colleagues, and then this post-pandemic reality that we want to get to. So I want to end by talking about this. What does it mean to impart hope, to cultivate a moral imagination? So I say beyond safety and connection, we want to impart hope. And over the summer, I spend a lot of time really just thinking about what does it mean to impart hope when we are feeling hope depleted, perhaps. And I looked at the research and the neuroscience of hope, the science of hope, and how powerful and empowering it is when hope is used as a tool to empower the person. So when I say hope, is what does it mean to wish for something better with the expectation of its fulfillment? And one essay in particular this summer that really I sat with it for, day in and day out, is one by James Baldwin. And in that essay, James Baldwin says, this is a picture of James Baldwin, he says, "I live a hope despite my knowing better." And this, despite my knowing better, I would stop at it and just wonder, is it ethical to talk about hope when I'm feeling hope depleted, or when I feel. And I looked at this when I looked at the neuroscience of hope, and we hope because we're able to make prediction because of that brain's capacity to gather information. And we gather information, so we have the information based on the now, based on history, based on memories, and also based on what matters to us. And this is where the cultivating the moral imagination comes in. So surely James Baldwin had reason against hope. He also cared about humanity, about the future, he loved the people. He aspired a better future, for a better future. And so it is important that we pause as educators and consider that question: what matters to us in higher education, in our society? And the last thing I want to say is, with respect to how do we move forward, is something I started with, and it is this poem by Rumi. And in this poem, he is telling this poem to young people who are struggling. And he says, in this translation, he just says, "Come, come, whoever you are, wanderer, worshiper, it doesn't matter." And he centers this on the community. Ours is not a caravan of despair. On the left is a painting by one of my former students who, when she saw this poem, she painted this, talking about students on their way to the future, to graduation or getting a degree, and they are walking on a road that's paved with hope. And in a way, it is us educators that are helping the students move from a present that is painful and uncertain, and cross a bridge to a future where they can be confident about. And so with that, I'm going to stop and invite you to ask questions. I wrote an article on hope still matters this summer after I struggled, that I invite you. It's an Inside Higher Ed, and I asked my colleague to actually put it in the chat. Invite you to look at it, where I say that it is that hope is not linear. That sometimes the appropriate reaction is not to say, "Oh, let's hope." Sometimes the appropriate reaction is to grieve, and perhaps to resist. And so how can we reignite our relationship with hope so we can impart it to others? And with that, Thank you so much for joining me, and we have time for questions right now and discussion. So I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you so much for joining us. That was fantastic.
Thank you.
Really insightful and meaningful. So thank you very much. There are quite a few comments. Let's see if we can get to all of them. Cole Lane, who is our student advocate who works in the Office of Student Success on campus, wrote, "I love the point of revealing our humanity to students and seeing theirs."
Thank you so much. Yes. And one thing that oftentimes perhaps we don't talk about, perhaps I don't hear about, is how often when that happens, revealing and seeing, in a way we become each other's mirror, and how empowering it is to the students and how healing it can be to the instructor. So one of the benefit of this trauma informed is when we see the student come to us, come to the class, come, and they struggle and they keep coming. They struggle and they keep, they give us hope, right? And it is them that help us heal in a way. So thank you for that comment.
And Beth Trammell, who is Associate Professor of Psychology, said, "These are really good misconceptions to realize and address. Thank you for sharing these."
Thank you.
And then Shara, TJ, and Michelle all commented about how this seems very well aligned with the transparent teaching framework.
Yes, of course. Yes, the transparent teaching framework is really critical. It is, I mean, at the neurobiological level, what happens when I have, and we don't want to overwhelm the students, but by giving them a 20-page document of why we're doing this assignment. But what it does is it shows that there is intentionality behind what we're doing. And this intentionality is not, so I ask my students, how can I help you? So this is semester, how can I help you succeed this semester? It was interesting. One of the top comments I got is, please don't give us busy work. And I thought, what is busy work? And so I looked at the literature, I looked at, what others have published before on this busy work, and students want to know that there is reason behind why they're doing what they're doing, and it connects. And again, I think at the brain level, what it does, it tells the limbic system is, I'm not wasting energy. This is worth it. Thank you for that comment.
Okay, and then from Deborah Miller, who's an assistant professor in psychology, she wrote, "This is great. As a therapist who trains new therapists, one of the things we emphasize must happen in the first session with clients is the installation of hope. It's essential and so helpful to hear someone else express not only hope, but offer to help you sustain your hope when you're feeling hopeless." Thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you so much, Deborah. So I during my research, I came across the anatomy of hope, where in the book the author talks about that it's not that there are no obstacle and everything is rosy. We are not talking about toxic positivity. Everything is going to be okay. But no, it is. We care about a better future. How can we continue to work towards that? And there's a lot of research with respect to helping patients hold on to hope, write about hope, document hope, and its impact on chronic pain, its impact on chronic diseases. It's really quite fascinating. There's a researcher at the University of Alberta, Denise Larson, who works on what does it mean to use hope as a verb, to use to use hope with patients. It's wonderful work. Thank you for that comment.
And then Cole Lane had another question. He put, do you have any thoughts or recommendations for staff who are more on the student services side of things, who sometimes have very short meetings or interactions with students?
So that's a great question. You know, whatever, it's the same framework. What can I say to help the student, to give the student that I care about them, to help them feel that they are seen, that they matter, that they're not just another number, right? And so imagine the staff does that, and then the student goes to the class and they get the same message, and then they run into an administrator and they get the same message. So every point at the institution, there is this, it's grounded in kindness and caring and humanity. That message gets reinforced and reinforced and reinforced. And the student starts believing that, okay, this I do matter. I do have a lot to offer. I'm more than a number. So, and I would also argue that it's really critical that we use this framework with each other, staff and faculty, and because the staff are struggling, faculty are struggling, administrators are struggling. It is so important. How do we welcome each other? How do we? My mom is so, she was so lenient on us. She's so lenient on us, and she would always say, well, she was not lenient when she said, "Did you care for someone's heart, or did you not?" So she was always, "How are you caring for somebody's heart?" And I think moving forward, and a lot of us are doing this, and a lot of us were doing this, but if the framework of the institution becomes one of caring, that we honor people's hearts, that we recognize their humanity, I really want to reveal my humanity to you, then we all benefit and the students benefit, and it can be empowering and healing.
Yeah. TJ Rivard, who is our Associate Vice Chancellor on campus, wrote, "Love this poem as a closing. Gives the sense that part of our work is to create space for renewal."
Thank you.
And then Michelle wrote, "Thank you so much. I am grateful for your message and the reminder about the importance of our own why and in helping others see their hope."
Thank you so much. Thank you.
And then one more just came in from Jessica Raposo. "I echo the accolades from my colleagues. I'm so glad to be able to apply this framework and context to what we may have been doing." I keep getting messages and it's moving me up. "And context to what we may have been doing instinctively thus far. I'm also struck by the intersections with the type of training that musicians and athletes do for performance anxiety, similar strategies along the way."
Wonderful. Thank you for making that connection. Thank you.
And then Melissa had another comment. "This has been quite affirming for the work I've been doing and points me in new directions of thought."
Thank you so much. I'm very grateful to all of you. I am grateful that you welcomed me into your community. I recognize that a lot of you care and care profoundly, and you are also struggling. So I do want to honor that and remind you that taking care of your own well-being and your heart is important, and it will help. It will have ripple effect. It will help your colleagues and your students, and so so spend some time with that. And I say that so I could remind myself to do that also. So thank you so much.
You have many people on Facebook talking about how amazing this is, just so you know.
Okay. Thank you so much. And